Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for our first Climate Match seminar. As I can see from the poll, most of you were already aware of Climate Match, either through being part of Climate Match Academy as a student or teaching assistant, or volunteered with us before. But there are also some new members to our community here. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to give you a very brief idea of what Climate Match is, and then Max is going to give a roughly 45-minute seminar, and afterwards we'll have some time for question and answers. And if you want, on your screen, you should see at the bottom of your Zoom screen a Q&A button. So you can drop questions in there throughout the talk so that we can then address them at the end. So what is Climate Match? We're a team of almost 100 volunteers worldwide who came together starting last summer to put together or to work on creating a global community for climate science. And our first big milestone was launching a 2-week virtual program in computational tools for climate science, which went live. Climate Match Academy happened at the end of July. We had 500 students and teaching assistants from 70 countries. And I added the link to the course book here. So the materials from the course will be available forever and for free to everyone. Please keep using the materials. We know there was a lot to take in during the course, so you can revisit everything or you can start learning by yourself anytime. And then we still have an ongoing, or we're ramping up to our Impact Scholar program, which will be a program that former students and teaching assistants can apply to continue their research after the course and receive computational support as well as mentoring from our end. And the applications for that are going to be due towards the end of August. And I will drop these links in the chat as well in a minute. And then we have our seminars. This is going to be the first one. And so that's why we're here. So let's jump into it. Today we have Max Puelma Touzel with us. He's from the University of Montreal. And Max works at the intersection of behavioral science and artificial intelligence. His background is in computational modeling and mathematical theory, and he used to primarily apply these skills to problems in computational neuroscience, immunology, reinforcement learning. But he is now focused on how belief formation impacts social dilemmas and alignment programs in service of improving communication and public discourse. And he's specifically focusing on effective sustainability transition policies for addressing the climate emergency. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Max.
Great, thank you, Natalie. Very kind introduction. My rather unconventional academic career path makes it difficult to synthesize, and you did a good job. So let's see. I think if I do this, and then I think it's a function of 12. Let's see. There. Is that full screen? Yeah, okay. Okay, so hi everyone, thanks for joining. Great to see you all again. I mean, part of doing this, I think, was just an excuse for us to get back together again. But the content that I'll present today is something I think that you guys will find useful and interesting. I know I had a lot of fun putting it together. This was actually originally supposed to be the outro of the curriculum day, but let me get into it just to sort of frame things. So it's 2023 and we're in the climate emergency, right? There's all these like wildfires. It's definitely like climate is a thing now. Climate emergency is sort of this narrative in society. And so what are we going to do? So as Natalie was saying, we did this Climate Match Academy. A bunch of scientists were like, what do we do? And so we came together to make this 2-week course. And so, for instance, one of the days, so most of it was climate science, but the curriculum was pretty broad. And we had a day of socioeconomic content where there are tutorial videos that you can watch because all the content is free and online forever. So the first tutorial was on socioeconomic origins. The video, that's 16 minutes, transition goals and economic modeling, 17 minutes, transition narratives and integrated assessment models, 13 minutes, and public opinion and narrative communication, 8 minutes. So in about the time that you would watch this seminar, you could also go and watch all of these. And what I'm going to talk about today is sort of complementary to those. So I'm actually not going to talk about a lot of interesting stuff related to the sociology of the transition and sort of the sort of details of the structure of how the energy transition is sort of structured, because that's all in the content that we've already covered. So if you haven't had a chance to look at those, they're free and online. I guess you can find them in the online Jupyter notebook, but check those out. Okay, so now that the cohort has sort of come out of the course, you have all these computational skills. And so the idea is now you're sort of primed to do impactful research. But now this is the question. So impact on what? What does impactful research mean? On who? Which populations? How? How will you do it? And like why? What are the values inside you, or what are your motivations that lead you to want to take on a sort of applied research project in climate science? And so today what I want to do is build off this idea that there is this background thing going on, which is that this whole society is sort of generated this transition narrative of what we have to do to address the climate emergency, and that's being interpreted by the beliefs of all sorts of different actors and stakeholders. And there's this really complex network of incentive structures that are going to push different actors to do different things. And so as you try to figure out where it is you think you want to go with these computational skills that you've learned, I'm hoping that today I can try to transmit some of the complexity of this lay of the land, and at the very least, get you to sort of improve your world model, so you're better informed when you make that decision of what you want to do. Okay, so the outline for the talk, I'll cover these sort of 6 sections. This is the first time I've given this talk, and it's a bit of a mishmash of the content that was left over from my day, but I've put it together in hopefully a sort of coherent sequence. So first I'll go over what the transition means, like what is a transition. Then I'll go over the IPCC and what it is as an organization, because they're the ones that are setting the at least published sort of mainstream understanding of why we're doing the transition and what it means, et cetera. And then I'll talk about the sociology of societal change and how we think about how our society makes changes. And then I'll talk about complex coordination problems and how we think about those, and then go through some case studies of sort of environment-related legislation in the past and how that's worked out. And then I'll end with some sort of current momentum on how things are going along this transition trajectory. Okay, so let's start with what is a transition. So this is actually a slide from another talk of the day, but I thought I'd bring it up again because I think it's useful for framing things. It's the causal chain that ends in climate change damage, which is the thing that we're most worried about. So this starts with fossil fuel production that feeds energy consumption, producing greenhouse gas emissions that trap heat, and that heats up our environment, and finally generating damages through effects like extreme weather events. So let's look at a projection of future climate damages and how we can reduce them. So the goal is to stay out of the region of high climate impacts, shown here in high intensity of red. And that's where we're headed currently, because we're still emitting lots of greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels every year. And the first and most important thing we need to do is to cut those emissions. So to flatten the impact curve, to take a metaphor from the pandemic. And this can be done through demand side mitigation that reduces consumption, but also supply side mitigation, which tends to be more the focus that lowers the emissions intensity of consumption by shuttering down fossil fuel power generation and scaling up renewables and electrifying everything. That's one of the main sort of transition ideas. But the reality is there's so much greenhouse gas in the atmosphere already that even with our best mitigation efforts, it'll probably level out too far in the red zone. So this means we'll also need to remove large amounts of greenhouse gases to get back down to a level of damages that's manageable in the long term. And emissions removal, or what's called negative emissions technology, might be able to eventually restore the balance, but these technologies are unlikely to ever scale up or enough or soon enough to prioritize them right now as sort of the main thing. So damaging impacts will likely exceed what we can tolerate for some time to come. So that means we, in addition, need stopgap measures that temporarily cool the planet to keep us out of the red zone in the meantime. And this is, for instance, solar radiation management, or SRM, that, for instance, would reflect the sun's radiation out into space before it converts to heat and has a chance to get trapped. And then finally, as the final thing that we can do is just to try to limit the damaging effects of warming by adapting. This can be done in place, like with temperature-controlled environments and heat-tolerant crops, and by moving humans and food production, as well as natural and physical capital, to less affected regions. So stepping back a bit, this is the goal, right? This is what we want to sort of see, but this is all a physical picture, right? I haven't said anything about society in describing this solution to the climate emergency, because it's actually ambiguous about the socio-economic path that we take to realize it. And that path is actually laden with choices about what we value. And so that's kind of what this talk is about. What's the societal path that we want to take to realize this physical goal? And there are different views on what needs to happen. So there's three main ideologies that I'll go over now. So the first is the degrowther position, which basically says, which advocates for dismantling growth-focused capitalism to slow down first world consumption. And there's a lot of out-of-doctrine common sense in degrowth, but also significant structural and social barriers to collectively deciding to put it into play. And I think the movement could actually gain mass appeal if it would sort of center itself around overcoming those barriers and becoming more widely appealing. So then there's the eco-modernist position. This is sort of the techno-economic accelerationist response that argues for technological solutions, which would mobilize massive amounts of labor and or capital, depending on your politics, to incentivize innovation. And this position risks tech solutionism, which is this idea that sort of a naive optimism in the ability of our systems to produce the technologies that really do solve the problem. And which is a problem with sort of poor delayed feedback, which makes it really hard to figure out what actually works. And so finally, as a third ideology, there are the deep adaptationists who claim that the situation is already too far gone to be reversed, and we need to start by accepting that. A sense of climate anxiety and even despair may be on the rise globally with regards to climate, but I gather that actually most deep adaptationists are actually pretty constructive about how they focus their time. They seem to have built a psychology that channels climate anxiety into a humane sense of belonging, serenity, and even action, which I think could actually serve any climate movement. Unfortunately, collapse is often baked into the premise of that movement at a level of certainty that I just think is unjustified currently. And it seems to kind of drain our motivation to make bold within system changes. So these are the three sort of main ideologies. The position that the establishment has taken is mostly eco-modernist, but degrowth and demand side approaches are also gaining ground. And ideally, a future climate movement would be able to take the promising parts of each of these three ideologies. So these aren't mutually exclusive, and I think we should try to, find the best of all three. That said, there are sort of fundamental disagreements between these camps, as you can imagine. So I'm just going to list some here that just came to mind. So the first here is whether strong global decoupling of economic growth from sort of physical resources is possible. Eco-modernists would eco-economic decoupling, right, is when economic activity can grow while physical resources don't. And eco-modernists use a weaker definition of decoupling and thus tend to say decoupling is a real possibility, whereas degrowthers use a stricter definition, and from that definition argue that it's not possible. So a second area of disagreement is the importance of negative emissions technologies. Those are the ones that I was talking about before that take greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. And that's obviously supported by the eco-modernist establishment, right? Because it's this like technological solution, but it's considered too risky a bet for degrowthers and deep adaptationists. And is sort of the idea that it deflects away from the sort of more central problems that they think we need to solve. Third point is to what degree adaptation using technology can really insulate us from the damaging effects of climate change. So again, eco-modernists say significantly, whereas degrowthers and deep adaptationists say no. And finally, a fourth that I have here is the degree to which the establishment, which I guess is exemplified by like world governments, the IPCC, World Banks, et cetera, are contributing to an effective solution to the climate emergency. So deep adaptationists and degrowthers are fairly convinced that the establishment is not really contributing as much as is needed, given its kind of neoliberal bent. So there's a lot of sort of accusations of within system thinking. And degrowthers and deep adaptationists differ here, however, in the scale on which they think actions should be made. So typically degrowthers think in large-scale mobilization and social planning, whereas deep adaptationists can be more focused on sort of local communities adapting themselves. Okay, so just to sort of go on to this idea of like what the mainstream sort of philosophy is, there's this recent textbook that lists a bunch of assumptions implicit in the sort of liberalism, but I guess you could think sort of neoliberal economics framing of the climate change problem. One is that it's not a challenge to individualism, that's what they say, that its construction is sort of universally true. So the way that it's been formulated is the only way to formulate it. And that climate change is not a historical phenomenon, so it's not about the world changing. It's that we're in sort of the final state of history, and we just have to make some sort of small change. And then another thing, another assumption is that we actually have the technologies to solve climate change. I added these subpoints here because it's not. I wanted to make clear that the assumption is not that or the criticism, I guess, is not that we don't have the technologies, but there's a whole bunch of other things that are needed to implement things beyond just having the technology, right? And so, for instance, the assumption that industrial technology can actually be harnessed and controlled for the greater good. Maybe in some cases it was, I guess, if you think of like World War II and things like that, things did happen, but it's pretty hard. Another, the path of technological innovation is compatible with greater democracy and freedom, right? So there's this sort of notion of progress that is sort of embedded in how we frame the notion of the transition. And then there's this third point here. So democracy and freedom are synonymous with a zero carbon capitalist economy. So there are many ways to think of how this could play out. We could sort of maybe, authoritarian regimes take over and they somehow manage to get us to a zero carbon economy. I don't think that's realistic, but I'm just saying there are these like many different scenarios that could happen. And then finally, so the fifth point is that stories will save us, that climate change is a narrative problem. That's an assumption, right? All these communications, people are thinking like, what's the right framing? And that's an assumption. Maybe there is like this sweet spot. I mean, of course, it's probably demographic specific, but it's unclear if framing alone is going to do it. So this is the sort of negative, sort of like question your assumptions perspective that I just wanted to plant out there so that you can appreciate that there are these sort of critical views of what the mainstream is. That's more abstract. More practically, if we do want to do this transition, there's going to be all these implementation issues that come up. So things like how we measure emissions, how we monitor compliance, how we enforce regulation uniformly across the world. These are all hard problems. And every interest that's out there is organized, that's organized. So like fossil fuel companies, investment firms, government departments, they all have goals and they're all looking for opportunities to achieve those goals. And a transition provides such an opportunity because the mandate to change loosens the rigidity of the status quo, right? So how we do all these things is almost certainly going to be shaped by those interests, and there's a risk they're shaped in ways that weaken how effective they'll be. So for instance, promises of profitable future innovation can outshine calls for more effective and cheap reductions that we could do right now. Or allowing existing law to be rewritten opens the door to sort of self-interested attacks on existing regulation. And another issue is something called Goodhart's law, which is that it's non-trivial to design transition incentives that get target actors to make the intended changes. And that target actors can even respond in unintended ways that makes the problem worse. So in this vein, incentivizing energy efficient technology could actually backfire in some cases because efficiency savings would then be reinvested to expand production, not reduce it. This has happened enough times in the past that it's got a name. It's called Jevons paradox. And then finally, virtually all metrics are a choice of what to value, and so come laden with assumptions about what is valuable. So this can determine what we emphasize. For example, demand side measures like reducing consumption, or supply side measures like increasing efficiency. So some prominent indices, like the Environmental Performance Index here, relate more actually to quality of life than to wasting and depleting resources. And so these typically find the West far ahead of the rest of the world. So we see the global West here, the x-axis is the index, and we're doing great. Western countries are doing great. Look at these sub-Saharan Africa, all very, very poor on this index. But these and other green growth metrics are contrasted with metrics that focus on intensity of material use. So here, for instance, material footprint per capita in red, and domestic material consumption in green. And these typically don't have high-income nations performing best, just because high-income nations tend to consume a lot. So metrics will form the basis for how we allocate the massive transition funds. And so which ones we agree to use are crucially important. I just want to say, Natalie, I'm not watching the chat. So if something comes up, just pop in and let me know. I'm happy to.
Yep, I'm taking care of the chat.
Great, thank you. Okay, so that's led people to come up with this notion of what's called a just transition, just as in justice. And so the high level idea here is that the way technocratic solutions quantify progress reflects the prejudices of the times and thus tends to disadvantage less represented peoples. And so we need to be extra attentive to making sure we're being inclusive. Otherwise, this whole sort of societal change endeavor risks just supercharging existing oppressive power relationships. And so this arises in global climate meetings, where actually from the very beginning, the dialogue has acknowledged a very specific term called common but differentiated responsibilities. This was stated in reports all the way back in 1992, which is the idea that rich countries have emitted much more historical CO2 and so should shoulder more of the economic costs in addressing the climate emergency. So some other aspects to a just transition are that it applies to how we deal with the workforce. So helping those whose jobs will be lost, and also including organized labor. For social classes, there's also a component, which is that the associated racial and ethnic a just transition means acknowledging that underdeveloped nations and demographics are both less responsible and more vulnerable. They've been historically excluded from progress through many systemic injustices, like not being included because of not being measured, which is something called the McNamara fallacy, which is, I think, important in many dimensions of this problem. And a just transition tries to acknowledge and correct for that. And this could actually be a wedge issue in the climate movement going forward, the degree to which the changes proposed actually do have these just transition components. Okay, so that's sort of, that was the transition part. So that's now I'm going to move to some other things. First, I wanted to do a short section on the IPCC, just so you guys know what it is, because it's the organization that's sort of setting the mainstream narrative of how bad things are and sort of like what we would need to do to combat them. So it's an organization. It's a bunch of people in buildings in, various places, going to work every day. There's institutional structures, bureaucracy, office politics. So at the top, there's it's a 35, so it's structured with a chair, and the chair organizes a bureau that directs a panel of hundreds of expert scientific reviewers. The IPCC doesn't actually do original research. It's more of a synthesizer, and there are three working groups. The first one is the climate science basis one. Then there's one on sort of mitigation, and then a third one on impact, adaptation, and vulnerability. And then finally, there's a task force on emissions budgets that are sort of trying to measure how well we're doing. Okay. So there are some downsides to this bureaucracy. Let me start with the downsides and I'll go to the upsides. So the downsides is that it's not very agile. It updates infrequently. It has bottlenecks in editing the reports that it puts out, so that the work of hundreds of reviewers often has to go through just a handful of people in a tight window just before a deadline. And historically, this has led to problems. That said, there's a trend, especially in the difference between the AR5 report and the AR6 report, of including better models and a more nuanced perspective. So it does seem that it's an organization that is trying to adapt. And second, as an institution formed by representatives of many nations, each with their own agenda, what it produces for the world passes through an intensely political process. The line-by-line negotiations for the most recent synthesis report are actually full of changes that actually weaken the language. Saudi Arabia made the most changes out of any country, and they even removed a line that stated that fossil fuels are the cause of climate change. So this document and the documents that it put out are meshed with this complex political landscape that we live in. And then finally, through the central role that, so in this ideological point, the central role that integrated assessment models have played through the central role that integrated assessment models have played in the IPCC's reports, it's traditionally had a fairly sort of neoliberal economic bent. And up to a decade ago, the organization actually had some very senior people playing down the effects of climate change, kind of actively. That's changing for sure. Again, in the newest AR6 report, you can finally read about demand side issues that are, which acknowledge that an effective way to reduce emissions is to sort of de-emphasize consumption, in contrast to supply side issues, which tend to focus solely on increasing efficiency. Okay, so that's sort of weaknesses. However, I think it's also really important, as much as IPCC has some flaws, to acknowledge the strengths of it as this sort of singular institution, because it can play an important role in directing a legitimate response to climate change. So the first is that it's a truly international effort, and so it can speak with somewhat global authority. It does this as the single loudest voice that governments, the public, and even companies listen to. So the way it defines terms can then incentivize certain policies over others, and that's a huge power. So it's also a very structured process, in which a large variety of voices get heard and analyses are performed in different ways. And so that diversity makes the conclusions the organization comes to more, in principle, more robust. It's also led to sort of more explicit things like a emissions target framework for member states, the so-called nationally determined contribution. So there's sort of targets that are like publicly there, that's sort of like, you need to do this. And that kind of global international political pressure, in principle, can play an important role. So I think it's important to acknowledge that. Just to give a sense of sort of how the IPCC's reports have sort of evolved and adapt, let's take the statement in the sequence of reports over the last 2 or 3 decades in which they make the claim that climate change is human caused. There's a single statement basically in all of the reports that sort of makes that claim. And you can imagine how much people have tried to edit that, or thought about how to specifically write that. So in 2001, the report says that the connection is likely. In 2007, it says it's very likely. 2013, it says it's extremely likely. And in 2021, it says it's unequivocal. And it gives sort of more concrete ranges of estimates and stuff. And so this demonstrates that it's trying to incorporate more quantification, more clarity. So it's just interesting to see the language of how we frame the narrative becoming more crystallized and more clear, and to think about what factors go into that process. So for instance, now there's a fairly prescriptive method, at least for how to communicate uncertainty in statements regarding the projections in the IPCC report. So that said, the prescription is not always self-consistent or balanced. So for instance, Janswood here in Climate Change in 2020 wrote a paper in which he sort of analyzes the uncertainty language and finds that the language in working group 1, which is more like physical science, uses a lot of likelihood, because that's like a more like sciencey probabilistic term, whereas the word confidence is used more in the working groups 2 and 3, because that's more sort of social sciencey. So it's not like things are super prescriptive, but there is different choices of language. And because institutions tend to point back to the IPCC whenever they want to sort of say that they're doing the right thing, the language is actually super important, because it affects how convincing those statements are. So the question is, who is the IPCC trying to convince? That's an outstanding question. I mean, basically the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is made up of lots of entities. So let's start talking about how to think about a world full of complex super agents and institutions, corporations, countries, despots, everybody. So this is actually a map of the way that the integrated assessment modeling work tends to break down the world in terms of various things. So I'm sure there are sort of ethnic and cultural considerations that go into how this breakdown is happening. So I don't know if you can see it, but this is North America, this is, you know, Africa, this is Asia, Australia. So how would you determine these boundaries? How do you group countries
Max,
to sort of make sense of the world? Yeah.
just to quickly throw in, we've got 15
Yeah.
minutes left, so maybe if
Mm-hmm.
we want to leave time for questions, we need
Mm-hmm.
to move along a little bit.
Yeah. So this was at least a 45-minute talk, maybe more. So
Let's just make sure
now,
we cover the important
yeah.
bits.
So I'm at slide 19. There's still a fair bit to go. What about splitting it in two and doing another one in a couple weeks? Because I feel like there's already enough content that I feel like people probably have lots of questions just on this. I mean, we don't have to set a time for the rest of it, but maybe what I can do is finish like the next section and then we can stop there, because I think the sections are somewhat sort of self-contained.
Okay, sounds like a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, unless we want to end with this section, because I'm just starting now, so we could just stop here. Do you feel like there's a lot of questions?
I'd go through another one. We started pretty late, so let's
Okay.
go through this one.
All right, great. Okay, so this section is about sort of how to think about the sociology of world problems, which is not obvious at all, right? World systems. So the world as an idea didn't really exist more than 50, 100, 200 years ago, right? The international coupling of all the different countries around the world and the degree to which technology allows for sort of global communication is a relatively recent phenomena. So world systems analysis was developed in the 1970s by Emanuel Wallerstein and others within sociology to grapple with the globalization of social phenomena. So that can be explicit, as in sort of the exportation of Western culture, but it can also more broadly be implicit in how distinct and distributed modes of production structure the flow of capital and available jobs, which then influence and shape local policy and public sentiment across all of the globe, right? You know, there's the stories of like how like the next fad of whatever, you know, vegetable ends up like completely reworking entire agricultural lands of foreign countries, of agricultural countries. So the analysis is not so much about making normative claims about how things should be, but just observing how they are currently. And there's also a heterogeneity of culture and values here that and their evolution, as well as that of living standards. And socioeconomics and cultural values place pressures on each other. And among these pressures, the corporate profit motive is currently one of the strongest forces shaping our society's rules and capital wealth. And core to that motif is a doctrine of growth, and more recently, a kind of narrative of progress. So from this perspective, how is climate change going to sort of interact with this, with that structure? So here are a bunch of sort of potential tipping points in the climate system. All of it is very sort of uncertain, and it's sort of unclear which ones are going to be big deals or not. But I mean, especially this year, things, you know, with the El Nino, you know, things are starting to, people are starting to get worried that maybe some of these are going to start tripping soon. So, a more sort of systems modeling perspective tries to account for how these changes impact, you know, the socio-political map that I showed on the previous page. And in the context of climate change, they identify sort of specific mechanisms within which collective opinion dynamics can actually elicit widespread action. So for instance, right, this notion of tipping point. Right, so this guy, Lenton, has sort of put out a bunch of tipping point stuff in climate, and then he decided to think about the idea in sort of social aspects. And so as climate change sort of ramps up, how is this going to affect things like the financial markets, and like when Florida is like, when people stop buying houses in Florida, how is that going to affect the insurance industry and all of these other sort of big players? These are going to be strong interacting effects between the physical and the social, and there might be tipping points in both. Like people just suddenly say, you know what, I'm not buying in Florida, and then everyone else says they're not buying in Florida, and then no one's buying in Florida, and then what happens to the economy? Okay, I'm not going to go through this because it's sort of dense, but you can check out this paper by Otto et al. In PNAS in 2019. Okay, so academics have for some time studied the factors underlying phases of rapid change in society and the roles that they play. So this includes the emergence of frames that effectively communicate the issue by speaking broadly held core beliefs when identifying problems and credible solutions. So there's often a core group of people pushing and feedback mechanisms that can lead to sort of widespread mobilization. And this mobilization can actually be quick if the frames resonate with sort of widespread public sentiment. However, collecting people into a movement isn't sufficient for change, right? It's not like that you get the pizza once you collect the money for it. Collecting people is the first step, and then you have to actually get them to do stuff. And that's there's a lot of work on the theory of social change that has sort of addressed that has sort of categorized different social movements and the like. This is just I'm just going to sort of go through this quickly. This is basically one paper recently where a bunch of sort of people embedded in sort of climate and social stuff got together and just brainstormed some ways in which you could get social tipping points in collective cognition. So how populations think about climate change and how that affects actual how things play out. So there's opinion, there's social conformity, there's a policy that, and the opinion contributes to whether or not it's adopted, and how much it's adopted determines will affect how much emissions are produced. So for instance, like getting people to use something that's less emitting, there's sort of complicated feedback effects. As climate ramps up, maybe people are going to have less bandwidth to sort of think about this stuff, and so that's also going to drive some effect. And super complicated. You can come up with all kinds of different graphs. This I don't think is authoritative, but it's one. They just said let's come up with something to sort of start playing around and thinking about this. So that's one sort of academic route that you can think about how public perception, cost, and institutional responsiveness can be key factors in success outcomes. There's also the possibility in the near future for decisions to just go ahead with responses to climate without first building widespread public support. This is work cited from Elke Weber's group at Princeton, who looked at the sentiment of news coverage across the passing of measures to curb a population's behavior. So the left here is a smoking ban in NYC, and the right is instituting a carbon tax in BC. And this is just sampled from articles and stuff that were published and coming up with sort of like a rough sentiment analysis. And you see a time scale of like, I don't know, like a year of like when people were grumbling, they made the change. But then after a year, people don't really care anymore. So, we will adapt to changes also. So that's yet another dimension that you can think about how society, like top-down pressures. Okay, I think that's it. The next section is on coordination, which I think is a nice topic on itself. So maybe that's what will make the next seminar. So with that, I'll stop here and happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Max. This was a very interesting talk. For me, definitely something I don't think about every day, about public opinion and policy and how they contribute to climate change. I'm going to give the floor to our attendees in just a second. I just want to ask a question that myself. So based on what you told us today, especially about social tipping points, what advice would you give people who do want to have an impact and combat climate change actively themselves, what they personally can do?
Mm-hmm. I think, like, if I gave just one point, it would be start talking at the places and institutions that you're involved in. So if you work somewhere, talk to your coworkers and see, who else is interested, or just start getting it to be something that's talked about more. And there's a sort of tendency to sort of just take this idea that this is this like massive problem. I don't know where to start. But maybe just doing something tangible and local first can help. With regards to social tipping points in particular, so the social tipping point angle there was the idea that, if enough of your company starts caring about this and like pitching stuff, maybe the company decides to make a change at some point, right? And if there's a core group like you and a few other people, maybe that's all it needs to happen. With regards to these larger things, I think something that is way less developed than the sort of physical technology problems that are being addressed now are just measurement of social problems. So I think before we can sort of, maybe not before, but in parallel with coming up with ideas for like communication campaigns and things like that, we need to measure. We need to figure out like what people think, doing focus groups, market research, et cetera, et cetera. That's not typically available to your average scientist in terms of like the toolkit that they come with. So one of the tutorials on the socio-economic basis day that we did in the Climate Match Academy was to do text analysis from Twitter, which was sort of a fun exercise that starts to get you thinking that maybe you can use your computational tools to assess stuff and have like a side project in computational social science. So you could maybe start interacting with experts in that field and thinking of ways in which your own field and computational social science interact. That would be one suggestion.
That's really good advice. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We also have a question from the audience. I'm just going to read it out. What are your views that eco-modernist ideology actually encourage fossil fuel production? That it does slow down the climate emergency? So if I understand the question correctly, I think it's about whether taking an eco-modernist approach to mitigating climate change while still balancing fossil fuel production. How this can come together.
Yeah, definitely. So in one of the tutorials that we did on the shared socioeconomic pathway framework that the IPCC is set up, which I encourage you to all go watch because it's kind of interesting. So they came up with a bunch of different scenarios. Well, they came up with 5 that sort of put constraints on types of futures, and one is called taking the highway or something, and it's like it's sort of intensive fossil fuel development, which means we have lots more technology because we have lots more power, but it also means that we emit a lot more, and so we're able to do some things like make tons of air conditioners, to like maybe we send India like 10 million air conditioners, which save how many millions of people, but in the process of doing that we emit a bunch of stuff. So I would say that yes, it does. I mean, it's pretty established that sort of the eco-modernist view is that, well, likely we should make this renewable energy transition, but we're going to need to burn fossil fuel to get there, and let's burn baby burn. You could see, so one thing that I didn't get to that would be in the coordination thing that I'll do next is the recent Inflation Reduction Act in the United States that was passed a year ago, which is really substantive, but it is more an energy policy than a climate change policy, in the sense that it basically just ramps up energy. So it has secured a renewable energy sector in the world going forward, which was unclear before for this, and that's like a huge win. However, it also, in order to sort of get it passed and a bunch of other stuff, it's also very much sort of tied that with continued fossil fuel use, and that's obviously a problem because we don't really have much or any room to burn more. So I think this is sort of a long-winded answer, and I'm not sure if I mean the short answer is yes. Eco-modernist approaches do tend to allow for more fossil fuel development because they see that as essential in driving the industrial change to renewables, and that we will sort of figure out the adaptation stuff that we'll need in the process. But I don't know. There's so many things to discuss, but I think the short answer is yes.
Okay, we've hit the hour. I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you all very much for coming and joining us. Thank you so much, Max, for your talk.